Hello, I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I am your host for this podcast, and today it's just me. This is, of course, the midst of the Yuletide season, and I really just wish all of my colleagues and friends who have supported me in the first 6 to 8 months, about 6 months of this podcast, I want to wish them all a joyous and bountiful holiday season. So today you just get me. And today we're going to talk about all of these amazing winter holidays. Now, in the Northern Hemisphere, where I live, it is, of course, the middle of winter. And it's an important distinction that this whole festival season is far more than simply the date of, say, Christmas, or even the date of Hanukkah, which moves, or even the date of any of the other festivals that occur this time of year. Part of the reason for it is because of the season, and that is the literal season. So today, I'm going to talk about as many of these different seasons and celebrations as I can possibly cram into an hour-long podcast. But first and foremost, I want to wish everybody a happy everything. Happy holidays is actually the most polite way to say, I am wishing you all the best of all of the possible celebrations at this time of year. And of course, most of these holidays in the Northern Hemisphere are tied to the winter solstice. So we'll start there. The winter solstice is the shortest day of the year. And of course, in my other lectures and my other interviews, I've talked about the fact that particularly in the Middle Ages, the calendar was based on the agricultural calendar. And this is really midwinter. It's not the beginning of winter. It's actually the middle of winter. So the winter solstice that this year occurred on December, I'm looking at my calendar, occurred on December 21st. Sorry, I had to check that. Occurred on December 21st, so a week ago today, since I am filming this. The winter solstice is the shortest day of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, a lot of festivals in the agrarian, non-Christian, pagan winter calendars, all of those cross-quarter days, all of those Sabbats and celebration days occur the night before. You start at midnight the night before. So when we're talking about the winter solstice, celebrations would have begun, and for many people they did begin, on the eve of December 20th. And the longest night is actually that night before the solstice. The solstice itself marks that moment when the earth is positioned in such a way that this is the shortest day, and it's essentially sunrise on the day of the solstice. So the longest night for the winter solstice is the night before. And then at that solstice moment, at sunrise on the shortest day, because you've just had the longest night, we can welcome back the sun. Now, in the Middle Ages, there are references to midwinter. There are references to the gathering dark up until the middle of December, and then, of course, the returning light. And at this point, after the solstice, most of the festivals that were celebrated, whether they were Christianized or not Christianized, whether they occur outside of the scope of Western Europe, but still in the Northern Hemisphere, they all celebrate the return of light, because now the days are getting longer. And the days will continue to get longer until we get to midsummer, which is the summer solstice in the Northern Hemisphere. And of course, the Northern Hemisphere celebration of midsummer, and of course, that's where Shakespeare gets his Midsummer's Night's Dream. Midsummer is June 21st. And a lot of people are like, well, but is that midsummer? Is that the beginning of summer? Midsummer is June 21st because summer actually begins May 1st, at least in the Western European calendar. Now, all of this goes back to the Middle Ages. All of this goes back to the concept of the wheel of the year. And of course, that is something that is easy to find. But the wheel of the year is celebrated even still in some non-Christian traditions. Wiccans observe the turning of the wheel. They either have celebrations, Sabbaths, or they literally have a wheel that they turn for each season. I myself have one of these wheels, and I turn it for each of the cross-quarter days and the major feast days. But the whole idea of the wheel of the year is actually where we get some of our Yuletide traditions. Now, the word Yule, or Yale in Old English, it's Jol in Old Norse, actually derives from the word for wheel. So at this point in the winter solstice, this is the point where you turn the wheel and everything resets because now the light is returning. Again, all of this applies to the Northern Hemisphere and specifically the Western European tradition. So December 21st is the actual Yule. It is the winter solstice itself. Now, as we move through the wheel of the year, as the days get longer, as the seasons progress, then we get the other festivals, which in a lot of modern terminology adopts the Irish phrases. February 1st is Imbolc, which actually that day where you have the beginning of the spring season, you might say, well, what on earth is spring like about Ireland or Northern Europe on February 1st? Not a lot, but it's when you plow your fields. It's when you would start to prepare for the very beginning of that spring planting. And the festival of Imbolc was associated in Ireland with the goddess Bridget. Now, Bridget, that goddess figure gets Christianized in many traditions into the figure of Saint Bridget, the consort of Saint Patrick, who was said to have woven a special cross from reeds from the floor as she attended St. Patrick's sickbed. Now, Bridget, St. Bridget, and the goddess Bridget is also associated with the beginning of that warm season, the beginning of the planting season. And if you're going to celebrate Imbolc, you might make food that is light or lemony, and you get a lot of lemon curd and a lot of herby breads that are made in celebration for Imbolc. Now, as the wheel progresses, we get to March. March 21st is the equinox, the spring equinox, the vernal equinox. And of course, that was the feast day in Old English to Ostara, pre-Christian goddess of fertility. But it's also more or less the date of Easter. Now, an important thing to understand about medieval people when it came to calendars, particularly once Christianity spreads back into England, into Ireland, into Scotland, and those don't happen at the same time. In fact, Ireland adopts Christianity on its own terms. When the Romans pull out of Britain in 420, they take Christianity with them, more or less, and you end up with an island that has a lot of mixes of the traditional British, which is actually Welsh, pre-Christian traditions or non-Christian traditions, and you have some residual traces of Christianity from the Romans. But by and large, once the Romans leave the island of England and Wales and Cornwall and Scotland, Christianity only survives in traces. It's not until 597 CE that St. Augustine of Kent manages to convince the king of Kent, via his wife Bertha, to reconvert to Christianity. And it is at that point where the Christian conversion starts to spread through the various kingdoms of the Saxons, the Angles, the Utes, eventually getting up to the Danish kingdoms and the Danelaw. But of course, the Danes retained an awful lot of their non-Christian Norse traditions long after they technically adopted Christianity. Meanwhile, in Ireland was Christian far sooner, and it stayed Christian, partly and independently of the Roman influence. And I say partly and independently, it is still Catholicism. It's still Christianity. It still emanated from Rome, but it was not actually part of any Roman conquest or dominion of Ireland because, well, there is evidence of trade with the Roman Empire. The Romans didn't actually settle anywhere in Ireland. But Christianity takes hold and adapts and assimilates Irish traditions. And so, in a lot of ways, the reasons that we have these modern terms that are celebrated in modern paganism, modern Wiccan, that come from either Norse or Irish tradition is because of this syncretistic traditions, where you get the different religions that combine in order to essentially create something new. And we see this in the Wheel of the Year. So, as I said, we get to March 21st, which is this vernal equinox, the spring equinox. That is, of course, tied to the celebration of Easter. But in the Middle Ages, in medieval Europe, as Christian scholars were trying to figure out how to adopt the dates, the festivals, the feast days, especially as they related to the feast days of saints, which are pretty much tied to the day that a saint was killed in a hideous and horrible way, they were really interested in pinpointing the date of Easter. So you have all these manuscripts that are called Computus manuscripts that are all about computing a way to determine a date for Easter. And in some interests, like Bede's, in the Venerable Bede in the 8th century, when he's writing about the date of Easter and he's trying to ferret this out, in his De Temporum Rationale, is from about 725 CE. It's called The Reckoning of Time. Bede is really trying to figure out when should we celebrate Easter, because he was trying to separate it out from the Jewish celebration of Passover. Now, in Bede's text, when he talks about the reckoning of time in 725, he mentions a festival called Modrenicht. Now, Modrenicht means Mother's Night, and he puts that on December 25th. And of course, it is from that reference to Modrenicht, to Mother's Night, that a lot of different traditions decided, well, that's clearly a reference to the Virgin Mary, so obviously that was the day that Jesus was born. Probably not, but we'll get back to that. So Bede, in describing all these other festivals that already existed, was really interested in figuring out when Easter should happen. And of course, the calculation of Easter generally goes from the Feast of the Epiphany, which is January 6th, through the days leading up to Lent, then you have Easter, then you have Pentecost. And all of these are tied to the date of Jesus's birth, but also then the date that Mary comes back into the chapel. That's Candlemas, which also happens to coincide with February 1st. And we will have a whole episode just on kind of the late winter, early spring festivals associated with the Virgin Mary that get tied to the Catholic Church. Mardi Gras is, of course, a Catholic syncretistic tradition that is celebrated not only in New Orleans, but in Rio de Janeiro as Carnival, and of course in Venice as Carnival. Well, we'll have an episode entirely dedicated to that. I mention it now, though, to point out that the whole process of the Wheel of the Year was recognized as an agricultural celebration because you had to figure out, when do you start the process of tilling your fields? When do you start the process of planting? When do you pay attention to your livestock that are now in heat and breeding and then giving birth? When do you then look to your fields for whether or not they're growing, whether or not things are actually starting to produce, whether you're going to have a bountiful harvest later in the year? When do you begin your harvest? When do you fulfill the harvest? And when do you stop? All of these things are tied to the Wheel of the Year. And in my Halloween episode, I mentioned the fact that the Celtic New Year, that's Celtic in the linguistic and cultural sense, the idea of the Celtic New Year, the Irish New Year, is Samhain. which is November 1st. That period that marks the time of observance for the ancestors and marks the time when the veil between the worlds grow thin and the spirits of the underworld walk the earth, that is actually the beginning of the Yuletide season. It's not called Yuletide quite yet, but the entire part of November, when it is cold and everything has died and you're beginning to clear everything out in anticipation of the winter solstice, all of these things are tied together. But as I said, medieval theologians, medieval thinkers, philosophers, they were trying to figure out Easter. Easter was the important one for them. So the way that the dates get calculated and the way that the calendars get adopted, and you have the Gregorian calendar that replaces the Julian calendar, and so things are slightly off. The interest was, when was Easter? And of course, in Christian devotion, that's very, very important because, of course, Easter is the whole crucifixion and the resurrection. And then, of course, it leads to the ascension, which, of course, is Pentecost. The entire medieval European mindset was focused on the date of Easter. But all of these things are tied to a calendar that already existed. And that is the wheel. And so you go from Ostara, which is the fertility ritual, the mid-spring ritual of March 21st, which of course is right in the middle of your planting. You are starting to prepare your fields. You have actually tilled your fields by February 1st. You've planted, you are planting in March. You are putting things in the ground so that they can grow. Your livestock are getting ready to give birth. They are in the gestational period. And that, of course, takes everything to May 1st, which is Beltane. Beltane marks the beginning of summer. And of course, as we look at some of these festivals, a lot of them are tied to goddess figures. And in the Christian tradition, that either becomes a female saint like Brigid, who is co-opted into Saint Bridget, but also the Virgin Mary. And as I've said in some of my episodes dealing with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, you don't get any more goddess-like than the Mother of God. And the Virgin Mary becomes a touch point for several of these fertility rituals and festivals when they are Christianized. So May 1st is Beltane. June 1st, as I said, it's Litha. It's the summer solstice. It's also the feast day of John the Baptist, which is close. It's June the 24th. Then you get to August 1st, which is Lunasa, the celebration of the Irish god of the sun, Lugh. Also, the feast day of St. Peter in Chains. Then you get to Mabon, which is a modern term. It's actually a Welsh term that was coined in the 1970s as a more or less part of this adaptation of modern paganism, where the actual autumnal equinox is given its own terminology that marks its halfway point and its significance in relation to Ostara, which happens in March. Now, as I said, then that brings us to November 1st and Samhain. So now, because the Yule or the Yule has turned the wheel, we are now back at Yuletide. So, starting with the withering of the year, the start of that new year, the festival in honor of the god of the dead, we start to clear things out in preparation for the winter solstice. Now, most of the traditions that we think about in terms of Christmas time, and, it's not just tied to the American traditional Thanksgiving. People put up their Christmas decorations sometimes before Thanksgiving. That's not cool. I mean, really, could you at least give each holiday its due first? I put up my Yuletide decorations up the first weekend of December because that's when you should. The Yuletide season is not just the week of Christmas. It's not just a few days around Christmas. It is technically beginning of November, but it also gets at the beginning of December tied to the feast day of St. Nicholas. Now, in the Catholic tradition, the feast day of St. Nicholas of Myra is December 6th. And in a lot of European countries, still Sinterklaas in Dutch and other festivals that deal with the festival of St. Nicholas, that is his feast day. As I said before, every saint in the Catholic calendar has a feast day. Starting in the very advent of Christianity, the whole raft of saints who are martyred, either for defending Christianity or for resisting non-Christian tyranny, for resisting those pagan authorities that tried to put them to death or tried to interrogate them or essentially tried to forcibly convert them. Those people who stood up for what they felt was right, those people who acted as their conscience dictated at the time and were killed for it, they become saints of the early Christian church. And St. Nicholas of Myra has a variety of stories that are associated with him, but his feast day is December 6th. So, in a lot of European countries, the actual celebration of Christmas itself, the Christ's Mass, is in some cases secondary to St. Nicholas's Day, or perhaps in conjunction. But Sinterklaas, St. Nicholas's Day, is celebrated first, and that is on December 6th. Now, in the Austrian tradition and in other parts of Germany, what goes with Santa Claus or St. Nicholas is Krampus. Now, it's important to point out that Krampus, with his horns and his hooves and his woven basket in which he puts naughty children and he carries switches, Krampus is not a satanic figure. He is not a demon. He is not in any way evil Santa Claus. I mean, there's some really good movies. The movie Krampus is actually really good. I recommend that. There's several very good ones that kind of play on this idea. You know, there's some good movies to watch in this whole season where you're like, okay, doesn't have to be your warm and fuzzy. Because that's what Krampus is. Krampus is not satanic. He's not there to punish the good. Krampus is there to punish the bad. And this is not just minor infractions. This is essentially the origin of the naughty list, as it were. You have St. Nicholas on December 6th, but the night before is Krampus night. So Krampusnacht, December 5th, is the night that Krampus walks, the Krampuslauf. And if you go to Austria to this day, they still have Krampuslauf. They have big festivals and marches where various Krampus walk in procession and they switch children and they terrify. I mean, the whole point is to terrify you into behaving well. That's the idea. And it's not because it's somehow some kind of demonic celebration, but because of recognition that you need to be good to be rewarded, that people need to treat each other better than they have done. And so in a lot of the lore of the Yuletide, you get this symbiotic relationship between what can be construed as dark and light. But of course, that's not good and evil, because Krampus is not evil. Krampus works in tandem with St. Nicholas. In all of the processions for Krampus, St. Nicholas is there first. All of the Krampuses are either preceded or followed by St. Nicholas. You cannot have one without the other. The two things work in tandem. And that is a very important point of so many of these festivals and these holidays, is that you need to have the light, you need to have the dark, but that doesn't mean that the light is always good, unequivocally, and it doesn't mean that the dark is always evil, unequivocally. It's a lot more complicated, and it is a symbiotic relationship. So when we consider all of the various multi-religious traditions associated with this time of year, we need to keep in mind that as terrifying as some of these entities may seem, they're really not evil per se. So we begin the December season, we begin the Yuletide festivals with St. Nicholas's Day, but Krampusnacht the night before. And from that moment on, as in the Northern Hemisphere, we move to the shortest day, the longest night, and the shortest day of the winter solstice, you start to see an awful lot of localized traditions. Now, something very important to keep in mind is that a lot of these traditions that are now celebrated or people evoke them, they bring them up, a lot of these are the products of folklore. Now, folklore is different than literature, obviously, because literary traditions evolve out of a written culture. And I mean, literature's fiction. There are plenty of medieval texts that talk about various holiday celebrations. As I mentioned before, Pentecost, King Arthur gets associated with Pentecost all over the place because it's tied to the Christian calendar on purpose. It has a great significance. But there are equally a number of medieval literary sources that talk about Yuletide. In fact, one of my favorites is, of course, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Now, that 14th century alliterative epic, and I've talked about it before in conjunction with the Green Man, really is significant for the fact that it is set at Christmastide. In fact, if you read it in Middle English, this king lay at Camelot upon Christmas, with many lovely lord, ladies of the best, reckonly of the round table, although rich brether, with rich revel ort and wretchless mirths. Okay, let's just translate that. King Arthur lay at Camelot upon a Christmas tide, with many a gallant lord and lovely lady, and all the noble brotherhood of the Round Table. There they held rich revels with gay talk and jest, one while they would ride forth to joust and tourney, and again back to the court to make carols. For there was the feast holden 15 days, with all the mirth that men could devise, song and glee glorious to hear, in the daytime and dancing at night. Halls and chambers were crowded with noble guests, and the bravest of knights and the loveliest of ladies, and Arthur himself was the comeliest king that ever held a court. For all this fair folk were in their youth, the fairest and most fortunate under heaven, and the king himself of such fame that it were hard now to name so valiant a hero. Now the new year had but newly come in, and on that day a double portion was served on the high table to all the noble guests, and thither came the king with all his knights, when the service in the chapel had been sung to an end, and they greeted each other for the new year, and gave rich gifts, the one to the other, and they that received them were not worth that they may yet well believe. And the maidens laughed and made mirth till it was time to get them to meet. Now that is Jessie Weston's translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and I'll have a link to that up on the platforms. But the important point of that description is it describes a 15-day celebration, a full feast, a full period of revel and music and mirth and gifts tied to New Year's. Now, it's 15 days, so obviously it begins well before Christmas and well after Christmas. And at this moment, I want to point out that, okay, in fairness, it's a very annoying song. The song, The 12 Days of Christmas, actually refers to the 12 days after Christmas. It's not the 12 days before Christmas, it's the 12 days after Christmas, beginning on December 26th. So you go from December 26th until January 6th. Those are actually the 12 days of Christmas. But sure, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight doesn't even do that. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight says, hold my beer, have extra, it's Yuletide, and goes for 15 days. But it is also tied to gift giving and celebration. And I promise you, those halls are decked with boughs of holly. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, because holly, very defensive. It's prickly. It hurts. You got to be careful with that stuff. But also, it's evergreen. As long as it is attached to the tree itself, Holly will stay green through all the seasons, just like pine trees stay green. Now, of course, in a lot of circumstances, people want to say, well, what about oak trees and the green men and the foliate faces? We'll get there. But really, the figure of the Green Knight in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight represents in some ways a symbiotic manifestation of that evergreen aspect and the other world. Because the Green Knight is green. He's fucking green. He is entirely green, head to toe, completely green, except his eyes. When he bursts in at the hall door, because of course it's Yuletide and Arthur wants to see some marvel. And I've talked about this with the monsters episode. Marvels aren't necessarily evil. Marvels are something awe-inspiring. Marvels are something magical, something that you just can't quite believe. And there burst in at a hall door one terrible to behold, of stature greater than any on earth, from neck to loin so strong and thickly made, and with limbs so long and so great that he seemed even as a giant. Okay, he seemed even as a giant. He's not actually a giant. That's kind of like, oh my God, he's massive. He's like a fucking giant. Doesn't mean he actually is a giant. He just seems like one. That's an important point. And yet he was but a man, only the mightiest that might mount a steed, broad of chest and shoulders, slender of waist, and all his features of like fashion. But men marveled much at his color, for he rode even as a knight, yet was green all over. As I said, he's fucking green, entirely fucking green. His hair is green, his skin is green, his clothes are green, his horse is green. All of him is green except his eyes. And his eyes are red. Now, that does not signify demonic powers. That does not signify evil in any way, not even remotely. That signifies otherworldly magic. In a lot of medieval texts, in texts like Pwyll Pendeich Daifod and the Marriage of Branwen, all of these different Welsh stories from the Mabinogion, you get signifiers of the other world where either something has red eyes, or in the case of Pwyll Pendeich Daifod, he encounters white hounds with red ears. And the fact that they're pure white and have red ears should have been his biggest clue not to mess with them, because they're otherworldly. And of course, Pwyll messes with them, which brings about an entire story and an arrangement with King Arwen of the Fae, all of these things. But generally speaking, people recognized, all right, so something really large, it says it's a man. Okay, it's not actually a giant. Scholars disagree about this. Scholars argue based on their own versions of the translation. People will say, oh, the Green Knight's a giant. No, he's not. He is a man. The text says he's just a really tall man. I think he's a giant. He seems like a giant. He's a giant of a man. But he has magical power. And that magical power, as we will find at the end of the poem, is bestowed upon him by Morgan Le Fay. And the poem refers to Morgan as Morgan the Goddess. And I've written about this, and I can include some links to my article on Knight of God or the Goddess about the syncretistic traditions in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But at the end of the day, Morgan Le Fay, Arthur's half-sister, who is very skilled in the magical arts, who's very skilled as a sorceress, who's just very skilled in magic, full stop. And, you know, people say, well, she's evil. She wants to hurt Arthur. She wants to kill Guinevere. Okay, look, we all know the story of Arthur, Guinevere, Lancelot. And at this point in time, because Lancelot gets one mention in this poem, like a line, and that's it, if Guinevere were scared to death and knocked off before she could help destroy the Round Table, not necessarily a bad thing. But Morgan, the goddess, creates the magical illusion of the Green Knight. And this knight, who's huge but comely, he has a broad chest, broad shoulders, narrow waist, finely turned haunch. In other words, he's got a nice ass. He is very, very beautiful, but he's also not wearing armor. As the poem says, the knight bore no helm nor hauberk, neither gorget nor breastplate, neither shaft nor buckler to smite nor to shield, but in one hand he had a holly bough that is greenest when the groves are bare, and in his other an axe, huge and uncomely, a cruel weapon in fashion, if one would picture it. The head was an ell-yard long, it's about this size, the metal all of green steel and gold, the blade burnished bright with a broad edge, as well shapen to shear as a sharp razor. The steel was set into a strong staff, all bound round with iron, even to the end, and engraved in green with cunning work. He's also got around his waist, in his very ornate, courtly green garb, a girdle. Now, a girdle is a belt that you wear around your waist, and a girdle can be made of metal if you're lucky enough to have one created by the Armored Fairy, and I have mentioned them before. I have several of Armored Fairy's girdles for my various costuming needs. But if you don't have a metal one, chances are you would have one of woven cloth. You would have a girdle of silk or a girdle of wool, and it might be embroidered. And in this case, the green girdle is in fact embroidered. And the Green Knight is wearing it. And it is embroidered with green and greenish gold, and it's embroidered with all kinds of vines and birds and all kinds of beautiful vegetation, and he wears it around his waist. But an important point is that this knight is not dressed for battle. The poem is explicit. He is not wearing armor. He is not there for a fight. And he comes into the horse. Now, in fairness, it is bad form to ride your horse into the hall. Very bad form to do that. Very bad form. Don't do that. Don't ride your horse into the hall. It's rude. He does that. And of course, Arthur's like, ha, what do you want? And the Green Knight says, well, I'm here for a game. I am here for some Christmas sport. And Arthur says, great. You want to fight? Cool. I got knights. We'll fight you. Any of my guys, they will fight you. And the Green Knight's like, I didn't say I was here for a fight. In fact, I don't want to fight. And I am now paraphrasing. And the Green Knight says, I'm not here for a fight. I don't want to fight anybody. And Arthur says, great. We're here to fight you. We're knights. We'll fight. And the Green Knight's like, you're not listening. I am not here for a fight. I am here for a game. And the game that I would like to play is a test of resolution. You guys are the Knights of the Round Table. You have this extraordinary reputation that supposedly precedes you. I want to test that reputation. So if any of your brave knights, really, really brave knights, you're so brave. If any of your brave knights are willing to take up my axe, which has a very long blade and is also, by the way, not a battle weapon. This is a very unwieldy weapon to use for any actual kind of battle. It looks more ceremonial than anything. It is sharp and it will certainly do the job, but it's not necessarily there for battle. And the knight says, any of your knights can take my axe, and I would like an exchange of blows. It's a blow for a blow. He does not specify anything else. And initially, of course, Arthur's like looking at his knights. These are all the great knights of the Round Table. And to quote Monty Python, they soiled their armor. They're all looking around going, not me. I'm not going to fucking do it. Are you going to fucking do it? He's green. Are you fucking kidding me? No way. The guy offers you an axe and says, hit me with it. Why would you do that? But of course, somebody has to. And so Arthur stands up and says, fine, y'all are cowards. I'll do it. And of course, Arthur can't do it. He's the king. He is not supposed to. But he is young. He is rash. He is brash. He is a little hasty. And he jumps up to do it until his nephew, Gawain, says, no, my liege, I will do it. I am the least of all of you. Nobody will miss me. It's fine. I could die. I am the least among you. Okay, that's bullshit. It's complete bollocks, utter rubbish, because Gawain is not the least among them. Gawain is Arthur's nephew, and in the English tradition, Gawain is Arthur's best knight. Fuck off, Lancelot, it's Gawain. Starting with Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century, Gawain is Arthur's best knight, his most trustworthy, his most loyal counselor. He gives good counsel in the English texts. But in this text, he is going to take that challenge because Arthur cannot. And Arthur's like, cool, you can do it. But I highly recommend that if you're going to do it, that you cut off his head. Make it pay. Because if you cut off his head, then it's over. Now that's kind of cheating. Because the knight has said what he wants is a blow for a blow. And he gets to return the blow in a year and a day. Arthur, in suggesting that Gawain make this a killing blow, is basically trying to work around it. He's just basically trying to cheat. Now, Gawain's like, ooh, good idea. Let's do that. That's an excellent idea. Okay, it's not an excellent idea. Because think about it. He's fucking green. The Green Knight is fucking green. Do you really think that cutting off his head is going to have the desired outcome? No. And it doesn't, because Gawain goes, the knight puts himself in a very vulnerable position, kneels, makes his head bare, not because he necessarily wants or expects Gawain to cut off his head, but because it puts him in the most vulnerable position to show that he is not going to resist in any way. And Gawain cuts off his head. Because Arthur told him to, and Arthur's an idiot, and Gawain's a bit of an idiot. But there you go. They're all young. They're all rash. This is way too early in the Arthurian canon timeline, and they haven't learned anything yet. They may have a reputation, but there's some question about whether or not they really, truly deserve it. And in this context, what happens is Gawain cuts his head off. The Green Knight goes over, picks up his head, gets back on his horse, as you do, and the head speaks and is like, my turn. The my turn is, you have a year and a day to come find me. And as the wheel turns, Gawain has got to contemplate the rest of his life because he feels he's going to die. And then he's going to go on this journey to the west, the other world, Wales, basically, to find the Green Knight at the Green Chapel. Now, there's an awful lot that ensues in all of this, but the important thing is the poem marks the turn of the wheel. In fact, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight follows that whole calendar, that turning wheel. And when Gawain has to face his own mortality, because he thinks he's going to die, because he rather stupidly cut off the knight's head, dumbass. When he does that, he's convinced he's going to die. And so before he leaves Arthur's court to find the Green Knight in the Green Chapel by New Year's, he has a celebration, or rather, the Knights of Camelot celebrate him. They throw a feast in his honor. They throw a feast in his honor on November 1st. They probably started it the night before. So on Samhain, the Feast of All Saints, the Feast of the Dead, everybody at Camelot throws what they believe is a funeral feast for Gawain. Everybody's somber. Everybody is distressed. Everybody's kind of feeling, we're going to lose him. We're going to lose him. We're going to lose him. That's fair. He did cut off the knight's head. Dumbass. So they have a funeral feast for him on the Feast of All Saints on November 1st. And the poem is explicit. He leaves to go find the Green Knight the next day on the Feast of All Souls, Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. And so that calendrical progression where the wheel turns will acknowledge the Feast Day of the Dead, the end of that Celtic New Year, the beginning of that period of death and desolation until we get to the solstice. And of course, it is in that liminal period between Christmas and New Year's that Gawain encounters the Castle Haute Desert, Lord Bertilac, Lady Bertilac, his Aunt Morgan in disguise as an old woman, a hag, and then he has to face the Green Knight on New Year's Day. Now, there's an awful lot more to that poem, and I will have an entire episode dedicated specifically to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. You've got bits and pieces of it. But I'd like to point out that the Green Knight is not necessarily in any way related to the foliate faces of the Green Man. And in the Green Man episodes, I've talked about the fact that we don't really know what the foliate faces signify in medieval churches and on medieval architecture. But they probably hark back to this idea of rejuvenation and rebirth. They may very well be tied to that idea of rebirth or evergreen that comes in with the Yuletide. But I will also point out that if you've ever watched any version of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, the Ghost of Christmas Present almost invariably looks very much like the Green Knight from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And that's possibly because Dickens was aware of the stories. He probably didn't have any access to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight itself, but he would have been familiar with the tradition because there are plenty of later texts of Gawain encountering a Green Knight. And the Ghost of Christmas Present is usually envisioned as this jolly man with the beard who's green, who has holly, who has the green robes, unless, of course, it's Scrooged, and then it's Carol Kane. And she is a fae of an entirely different kind, but also still a fairy, still fae, still relevant in that Christmas magic. But it's entirely likely that those ghosts of Christmas Present that Dickens wanted to evoke is the same otherworldly spirit that we see in the Green Knight, who is Lord Bertilac, transformed by the magic of Morgan Le Fay. So when we talk about Yuletide and all of these different Yuletide traditions, they are intimately connected with medieval ideas of feasting and revelry and penance. And really, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the most important lesson that Gawain learns is about restraint, because the knight asks for a blow for a blow. He didn't say, cut off my head. And when I have an episode just on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I will go into great detail about the beheading game and whether this is a beheading match or not, because that's a huge question that many people argue about. Scholars, it's kind of like dating Beowulf. Friends don't let friends date Beowulf. The beheading game in this poem isn't necessarily a beheading game. It's a game. But Gawain doesn't have to cut off his head. He thinks it'll basically cancel out the challenge, but it doesn't, because again, he's fucking green. He should have known better. But when the Green Knight nicks Gawain on the neck for keeping the girdle, and we don't know that the girdle is actually magical. He thinks it is. Gawain thinks it is, but we don't actually have any evidence that it is, because the Green Knight knows everything. The game is rigged. It's all designed to test Gawain and see how he behaves, to see whether he follows through, which he does, to see whether or not he is cowardly enough to turn tail and run, which he does not. He keeps the girdle, yes, because he's human. Because unlike the Green Knight, his head will not reattach. And so the entire contest is about knightly restraint. The Green Knight, in nicking Gawain, shows him what he could have done. A blow does not mean a killing blow. Knights need to show mercy. Knights need to show restraint. Knights need to honor their oaths. They need to follow through on their trotha. And at the end of the poem, the only one who learns that lesson is Gawain. The rest of the Knights of the Round Table certainly do not learn that lesson. It is an enduring lesson for anybody faced with the deadly consequences of battle, of warfare, of putting other people's lives at risk. Restraint, mercy, compassion, combined with the knightly ideals of courtesy, fidelity, generosity, piety, chastity, maybe not so much. But combined with those values and those virtues, restraint, showing mercy and compassion when it is asked, and even when it's not. become very important lessons for that Yuletide period. In fact, this goes back to the whole celebration of St. Nicholas and Krampus, light and dark, good and a reminder of not so good, but punishing those who have transgressed, those who are not innocent. In fact, the whole Yuletide tradition as a multi-religious festival deals with this. Not only do we have Krampus, but you have other folkloric traditions. And as I said, folklore is largely oral tradition passed down through generations. What we have as modern folklore comes from oral stories that survive, not necessarily in written form, but through different traditions and rituals and how people celebrate these holidays. And then eventually they get written down. Now, folklore is a valuable way of seeing how cultures adapt to the various needs of their society. And Yule is no different from that. Yule as a multi-religious festival includes things like the Jólakötturinn, which is the Icelandic Yule cat. Now, the Icelandic Yule cat is this massive big cat that goes around from house to house on Christmas Eve, looking in windows to see if children have new clothes. If they don't have new clothes, the assumption of the Yule cat is that they weren't good enough, that they didn't behave, that they didn't pull their weight. So they didn't get new clothes. And not only does the Jólakötturinn eat the meal that's left out for it, it eats the children, as you do. It's kind of like Krampus, take the naughty kids. Now, whether the Yule cat tradition evolves in a time of need to recognize the necessity of generosity and hospitality. In fact, so many of these traditions are about food. You leave food out for St. Nick. You leave food out for Santa Claus. You leave food out for Jólakötturinn. The Mari Lwyd in Wales is all about gaining entry and hospitality, and there's a reason for that. It's because, particularly in midwinter, where you don't have your stores necessarily. People run through their supplies. They may have stored things up, but things are running short. You have your festival, your celebration as the light returns after the solstice, but your stores might be getting a little low. People might not have everything they need. And so the Yule cat in Iceland recognizes that you might need to have more hospitality. You might need to treat people better. And that gets tied to a lot of the different Yuletide traditions. You need to give your children new clothes. You need to care for them. You need to prepare to care for them so that in the depth of winter, your children don't die. So your children don't starve to death. So your children don't freeze to death. It's less a commentary on whether or not the kids are good, though it could be. You want the kids to pull their weight, especially when you've got, earlier societies where people needed to work constantly, pre-industrial societies where this was kind of an agrarian and, trying to grow stuff in Iceland was hard enough in the Middle Ages. It doesn't get a lot better until the industrial period. But this idea of everybody pulling together, a community needing to all contribute, that is where you get stories like the Yule Cat. But it's also look after your children. Feed them, clothe them, not just for celebration, but to keep them warm and keep them alive in the middle of winter. Now, I mentioned the Mari Lwyd. The Mari Lwyd is kind of creepy, kind of cool, very creepy, but also very cool. The Mari Lwyd is a Welsh tradition, first recorded about 1800. It's possible that it's a much older tradition. It's entirely possible. We don't know for sure. But the Mari Lwyd is a horse's skull on a stick with a white sheet, and the horse's skull is adorned with flowers and garlands and very festive things. And the Mari Lwyd and its band of celebrants goes from door to door on Christmas Eve and on Christmas, knocking on the door. And there's an exchange of poetry where basically the Mari Lwyd is trying to gain entry and asks to come in and be given food and drink. And they ask in poetry in Welsh, and everybody in the house has to respond in poetry in Welsh. That's how you celebrate this. And there's this contest, this debate, this back and forth between the Mari Lwyd and the people in the house. And ultimately, what will happen is you're going to let the Mari Lwyd in. You're going to let the Mari Lwyd in, and people are going to have their food, they're going to have their drink, and then they'll move on to the next house. Again, it's about hospitality. It's about letting people in during the darkest days of midwinter and feeding them and giving them drink and keeping them warm. The wassail, the idea of wassail, of caroling, was about going door to door and essentially asking for hospitality, but offering good cheer, offering music, offering gifts. All of these things are tied to the need of community, the need for people to treat each other better. Now, all of the holidays that are associated with this midwinter, with this idea of midwinter renewal and the return of the sun, focus on that sense of hospitality. Now, that's not a new thing. That goes back to the ancient world. As I have mentioned before, when you go to ancient Greek and Roman texts, you end up with gods that go door to door. And if you don't let them in and treat them well, they will kill you. Because if somebody shows up at your door, you want to give them hospitality because it could be a god. If you treat a god badly, you are in deep shit, generally speaking. Just ask Lycan, who was turned into a wolf. But in other traditions, even the Christian tradition, Christ would go as a guest, show up, and kind of gauge how people treated him. I mean, that was the idea, is that Christ would go in disguise, or just not so much in disguise, but just dressed humbly. And he could tell how people would treat him. If he went to the humblest house and they offered food, he would bless that house. That goes back to so many different traditions. It is not specific to Christianity. It is not specific to monotheism or polytheism, because it's all about communities that need to rely on each other, because people need each other. Other holidays that are associated with this time of year, like the Jewish tradition of Hanukkah. Now, Hanukkah is not the most important holiday in the Jewish calendar. Those are days like Yom Kippur. All of those days are far more important than Hanukkah, but Hanukkah is still an important holiday in the Jewish tradition. And it marks the 8 nights that the oil lasted in the temple while the Jewish people were under siege. And it is an important holiday to recognize not just the lasting of that oil, but the resistance against tyranny, the perseverance and the resilience of the Jewish people who were under threat at the time. And so Hanukkah recognizes and celebrates that spirit of resistance, that spirit of resilience, the light that lasts through the miracle of God, but also the need for community. And the need for community in the face of persecution and tyranny. Other holidays that get adapted to this, holidays like Kwanzaa. Kwanzaa, of course, is largely celebrated by African Americans, but it is tied to African traditions. And Kwanzaa begins December 26th and goes until January 1st. And the 7 principles of Kwanzaa are all tied to the idea of celebrating your ancestors, recognizing your history, the community, the shared suffering of a people for hundreds of years of enslavement in this country, but also the resilience and the perseverance of those people who have contributed so much to American society, but tying their history and essentially their identity back to their ancestors in Africa. And for each day of Kwanzaa, people light a candle for that day's principle. And those principles include things like unity, like self-determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics. You get the gist. Purpose, creativity, faith. All of these things are tied to that important idea of community, of supporting one another, of recognizing your heritage, recognizing the debt you owe to your ancestors. That is very similar to all of the other Yuletide festivals. Now, another aspect of the Yuletide, and I've mentioned this, when you get the dark and the light, you also get this sense of death and renewal. What is dying at the end of November will be renewed again as the light returns in the middle of December. That's part of the reason that you have so many ghost stories or scary things that are associated with this period of time. And there are all kinds of kind of terrifying traditions. Like I said, who wants a horse head outside your door? But the Mari Lwyd is not scary. The Mari Lwyd is not there to punish. The Mari Lwyd is an extension of hospitality. The Yule Cat only goes after those who have not shown hospitality and goodness. Other traditions, like those associated with the Perchta, the witches, and in some cases, perhaps even the Baba Yaga, the Slavic tradition of the witch in the woods in a house that has legs, it has chicken legs, and she rides around in a mortar with her pestle, and she uses her pestle kind of as a rudder for her mortar as she flies around in this thing, and her house on chicken legs moves. And the thing about the Baba Yaga, kind of like the witch in the woods of Hansel and Gretel, you got to ask yourself, is the witch really the problem in Hansel and Gretel? Or is it the parents who do not have enough food to feed their children and thus leave them in the woods to starve? Or is it the children who are greedy and start eating a poor woman's house? Is it the society that doesn't look after its own? Is it the society that allows children to starve? And the witch in the woods, the Perchta, the Baba Yaga, not necessarily evil. In fact, they can be good. They can do good things to those who deserve it. All of these traditions, the scary, scary things, and there's some brilliant stories like this scary book of Christmas lore. This kind of enumerates all of the folklore that I've been talking about, in addition to some other things. All of these traditions are about making sure that a community can survive the winter and that people will be healthy and well when it's necessary to start planting again. Now, of course, as we get into the industrialized world, so many of these stories get attached to ghost stories. And the Victorian Christmas crawler during the period of Queen Victoria from 1838 until 1901, it was so popular to have ghost stories. People loved to be scared at Christmas. They loved to have ghost stories. And you might ask yourself, well, why? Why ghost stories at Christmas time? Because it's dark. Because the days are short, and you're going to tell stories by firelight. You're going to tell stories by candlelight. But also because so many of these ghost stories are, again, about remembering the dead, about learning the lessons from the past, about revering your ancestors and learning those lessons. One of the best examples, of course, is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Now, that story came out in the 1840s and is actually what rejuvenates the celebration of Christmas in England. Because Christmas, as a celebration, celebrated throughout the Middle Ages, as evidenced in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, celebrated with feasting and festivals and boughs of holly and trees decorated and wrapped presents. All of that happened in the Middle Ages. All of that happens through the 16th century, though the Tudors would actually give their presents on New Year's Day. It's part of the whole 12 days of Christmas that goes from December 26th, the feast day of St. Stephen, until the Feast of the Epiphany. Now, the Feast of the Epiphany, January 6th, is when the wise men supposedly saw the star and in some cases either showed up or went on their way to find the baby Jesus. All of these things, depending on the story, are a little fuzzy of date, but the Feast of the Epiphany signifies the moment that the wise men went, oh, okay, this baby is important, he's special, he's son of God, whatever. That's the epiphany that they had. So in England, in Western Europe, the celebration of Christmas is not just the day of Christ's Mass, which is Yule, but also tied to the solstice. It is that period of time, those 12 days after Christmas, from December 26th until January 6th, when people would give presents. And on the turning of the actual calendrical year, on New Year's, is when a lot of people would continue to give gifts. Now, The ghost stories are attached to that, but they're also attached to Christmas time. And as I said, all through the 16th century in England, they celebrated Christmas this way until the 17th century. In 1649, when the Puritans take over, when the Puritans defeat King Charles I, and Oliver Cromwell takes it upon himself with a whole host of others to condemn Charles to death, and Charles is beheaded, and the English Parliament establishes the Commonwealth, and Oliver Cromwell puts himself at the head of that as the Lord Protector. Well, Cromwell was a Puritan. The Puritans are the same ones who came over to this country in 1620 in Massachusetts and proceeded to, once they stopped starving because the indigenous people helped them with that whole Thanksgiving thing. And then, of course, they persecuted the indigenous people who helped them, not just persecuted, but pretty much slaughtered all of them. There's thanks for you. Those Puritans are the same ones responsible for the Salem witch trials in 1692, because basically the Puritans felt that everybody needed to follow their religious ideology. Their religious ideology was an extreme form of Puritanism that said, we are the elect, we are the special ones, therefore you do what we say because we're going to heaven automatically. Okay? They believed in a purity of religion. They believed only in celebrating God, praying to God, but no celebration really, no music, no festivals, nothing. And so during the period of the Commonwealth from 1649, 1650, they established this as the state religion in England, or they tried to. And they actually enact laws to stop the celebration of these festivals and holidays. The Puritans literally canceled Christmas. They closed theaters, they banned musical performances, they enacted sumptuary laws that banned the wearing of bright and festive clothing. I'd be in big trouble. And they canceled Christmas. Now, that didn't mean they didn't venerate and pray and worship the birthday of Jesus as they knew it or thought of it, because they did that. You were allowed to do that, but only at prayer, only in actual church services. No presents, no music. They said that the celebration of Christmas in England was too pagan. I mean, they're right. They're totally right. I mean, Christmas trees, boughs of holly, presents, all that. Not Christian, not really Christian in any way. Really not. I mean, some of it, sure. But honestly, if you think about it, the wise men bringing gifts to Jesus, because every baby needs myrrh and frankincense and gold. Actually, that was more for the parents. Here, you can't buy your way into the inn. Let us give you some loot. That's kind of the point of all of that. In fact, the entire festival of the Epiphany and the three wise men is another act of hospitality. It's another act of giving so that the community can survive. If you think about it, all of these things are intimately connected, and they are also reflections of each other. And the Puritans went, nope, we are not going to celebrate it that way. You are not allowed. Now, after the Puritans fall out of favor and they fall out of power in 1659 when Cromwell dies of encephalitis, and that's a whole nother story, and Charles II is restored to the throne in 1660, he reinstitutes a lot of the festivals and celebrations. He reopens the theaters, and now women are allowed on stage. It's a whole cultural thing. Christmas is celebrated again, but it really doesn't take hold in the age of enlightenment and reason. It's not really until the 19th century, until the Victorian period, which now we have pre-industrialization. Now we have a growing population of urban poor. Now you have these divisions in the classes that are so much more pronounced. Charles Dickens writes A Christmas Carol, which is very short. And if you're familiar with Dickens, he wrote really long novels. Really long novels. I mean, stories like Bleak House. It's a bit bleak, in fairness. Also massive. Christmas Carol is very short, 100 pages. And in that story where Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by 4 ghosts, Jacob Marley shows up first, and then the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas future. And the ghost of Christmas future is always envisioned as a grim reaper figure, a memento mori, a reminder of death. That's important, because each of those ghostly figures in Dickens actually harks back to medieval images of the three living and the three dead, of those reminders of death that were so prominent in the 15th century and the 16th century. Actually, some of them stretch all the way back to the 13th century. But Dickens is familiar with these traditions, and he adopts that idea of Christmas past, present, and future as a reminder to everybody, not even just to Ebenezer Scrooge, but to everybody, that it is necessary to show kindness and hospitality, to be generous, to not hoard your wealth, to not keep more for yourself and give nothing to others. Because very much in that Dickensian sense, we have John Locke's principle that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that a community needs to look after each other. Because the stronger people are in a community, the healthier people are, the more educated people are, the more economically secure people are, the safer, more productive, more peaceful a society will be. And that is an important lesson that Dickens wanted Victorian England to understand. And of course, it revived the celebration of Christmas. And that is partly now why people in England and in America go back to decking their halls, because, of course, America was going to follow the Victorian model. And particularly in the 19th century, where you then get the American Civil War, after times of war, people need to find a light somewhere. And whatever place they can find it. And of course, what better way to find that light? What better way to welcome back the returning light is to be kind, to be generous, to look after your fellow human beings, whether they believe the same thing you believe, whether they follow the same traditions you follow. You should show them humanity, compassion, mercy. Going back to the lessons of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, we could all learn a little restraint. And in this period of time, now that the solstice is past, now that the light is returning, the most important thing to take away from all these different traditions is how important it is to behave as a community, as a society, and to show everybody generosity, compassion, and to essentially welcome back the light, but to make sure that you don't make it darker for everybody else. So, for this Yuletide episode, I would like to wish all of you, as the year is about to turn calendrically in a couple days for New Year's Day, I would like to wish you all peace, love, happiness, prosperity, and health for 2026. And I am Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this is Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.